Welcome to Beyond the B, an ongoing dialogue about the past, present, and future of the B Corp movement. Co-hosts Emmy Allison and Ryan Honeyman facilitate an open and honest conversation about the B Corp movement, advise companies on how to increase their impact, and provide a deep dive into the new B Corp standards that are shaping our community. I'm Emmy Allison, an impact advisor at Lyft Economy. I'm joined by my co-host, Ryan Honeyman, a partner at Lyft Economy, and our guest today is Bernard Gouw. In his role as Senior Manager Social Standards at B Lab, Bernard thinks about what it means for companies to be sustainability leaders when it comes to people. Labor and human rights have been common threads throughout his career, which includes organizations such as Oxfam and the United Nations. Bernard is part of the standards team at B Lab Global. This team is responsible for developing the new standards for B Corp certification, commonly known as the evolution of the standards. Bernard's remit covers a range of social topics, including fair work. Bernard, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Could you tell us a little bit about your background? How did you first get interested in the work that you're doing today?
Sure. So, from a very early age, I realized there were many social inequalities, and I found them very obvious. Some of the earliest ones I can remember were as a teenager going clubbing, and then just seeing how very different the experience was between men and women in clubs. This was in Spain where I grew up. And it was just glaringly obvious to me. And then as I continued growing older, more and more social inequalities became evident to me, also on a global scale. So I'm half Indian, half Dutch. So I grew up with two different types of extended families, and the difference between those two families was also glaringly obvious. So I had an interest in understanding why are there inequalities. And I focused on fair trade initially during my studies, fair trade certification, thought that was going to save the world. Clearly, it's not. So then learned more about what does work, what doesn't, and got more involved in trying to make companies treat people better as a way of addressing social inequality.
Awesome. And as we dive into these standards, just for folks who are listening, Bernard has sort of his remit also includes the JEDI standards as well and human rights standards. And so, Bernard, you may have to be on our podcast several more times in the coming months to cover these other topics. But today we're talking about fair work. And I know from working with you, Bernard, last year and when it was getting closer to these standards coming out, that it was really hard, it seemed like, at least from the outside, to get something that a lot of people could align around. And so I imagine this was a sort of an absolute beast, a difficult topic behind the scenes. And could you give us a little more backstory on the development of the fair work topic?
Absolutely. So you're right. There definitely have been difficult moments. I think what has helped, though, is that there's always good faith engagement. So even when there's disagreement, even though there is a lot of criticism, it's always been with good faith and with an eye towards making the standards, the draft standards, better. Honestly, I look back on the past few years, the public consultations that we did is really a highlight of my career. It really was a fantastic process to be part of. To make it a little bit more concrete for the listeners, I was thinking of two examples where there is a lot of this healthy tension, let's say. One is on workplace culture. So that's, of course, part of the fair work impact topic. And it's a very good example of how it's difficult to design and develop standards where you can't really latch onto the outcome. So in an ideal world, standards are outcome based. Living wage is a good example of that, right? Wages are about the outcome. Now, workplace culture is really hard to develop standards where you focus on the outcome, because the outcome is a good workplace culture. It's really hard to define that. It's hard to draw lines around that. So then we focus on the process instead. And so that's also where we landed after a lot of exploration, trying to figure out how can we make this work in a way that actually leads to impact. And so we have, in the end, workplace culture requirements that focus on the intent, at least, is a good process to measure workplace culture can then lead to improved measurement of workplace culture, can then lead to improved workplace culture.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out, because I know with the existing standards, the current, I don't know if we're calling them the old standards now, the current standards, I guess.
Yeah.
Current until the end of the year. I know with the version 6 standards, current, there was a sense that it was like, do this policy and that policy and sort of check the box a little bit, as opposed to really changing the culture or like changing the relationship with workers. So I'm curious, what are some of the mechanisms that maybe take that idea from the old standards of like, just have these policies to now the newer standards around like, how do you make it more living?
So where possible, we do try to be outcome driven or outcome focused. So, and this is where possible. And I think wages is a good example of this. The gender pay gap, close the gender pay gap. That's a really good example of an actual outcome driven requirement where we focus on what matters to people. Where that isn't possible, and that's quite often, I think a lot of times people don't realize that there are a lot of limitations to being in the compliance and certification space. You can't perfectly define everything. You can't draw perfect lines. I use this analogy that has mixed success, but it's like drawing a line in dry sand, right? You need wet sand to draw a clear line. And a lot of these topics that we're working on, it's dry sand. You try to draw a line and the sand kind of collapses. So what we try to do, as I mentioned, is we try to focus on the process. So the tangibles, thinking that if you have a good process, you can have a good outcome. We also try to set guardrails for what is a good process. And we try to set guardrails. A good example is that we have integrated into a lot of compliance criteria across all topics, the need to speak to stakeholders and engage with stakeholders. And that's it's a criterion that can be checked by the auditor. And if a company doesn't do that, they'll get a non-compliance. And so that's a good example of how, if a company does that as part of the process, that's a mechanism to improve outcomes, hopefully.
So maybe I'll combine this question. So it seemed like one of the biggest challenges was the living wage. And in particular, this idea of a family living wage versus an individual living wage. We had those conversations. And so I'm curious, was there a moment in the process when, especially around maybe the living wage requirement, we were like, this is never going to work. And this is just really frustrating. And what helped you push through to sort of get to that next level?
Yeah, maybe for the listeners, so both Ryan and I have smirks on our faces because we know how challenging this sub-requirement has been. Thinking back, I think this has been the sub-requirement that has been the most time-consuming of all the ones that I've worked on, so across all the social topics. And it's a combination of passion, wanting to make this work because it is so transformative, plus a lot of development over the past few years. An example is more data becoming available. Plus, of course, a new framework where new things become possible. And so there's a lot of testing that was involved. We started the process thinking there were a few things that we knew we wanted to have happen. One of those is moving from individual living wage to family living wage. And this is to align with global consensus. So if we look at the 19 living wage estimate sources that we accept, almost all of them don't even calculate or don't even provide an individual living wage data. I know for US listeners, this maybe comes as a shock because a lot of them will be using MIT calculator, which historically and still now it has an individual living wage. But if you look globally, it's really an outlier. So we knew that. We knew we wanted to recognize collective bargaining as an equal. So for those less familiar, that's when a union negotiates wages on behalf of workers with the employer, has a lot of value and is not the same as a living wage, an entirely different process. And we wanted to recognize the value of collective bargains. We wanted to recognize that as an equal. And we also knew we wanted to build on all of the extra work that we had put in on living wage. So version 6 of the standards, the current standards, and that was around 2022. So we knew there were a few things that we wanted to do, but there was still this feeling of how far can we push this? So I've already said I like analogies. Let's see if this one works. It's like a rubber band. There's always a question of how far can you stretch it without it snapping? And so we were wondering, how far can we stretch this band? Can we make it mandatory for all B Corps to pay a living wage, yes or no? And one of the things that honestly muddied the water a little bit was in 2022, we made quite a few changes to version 6 of the standards around living wage, making it actually easier to pay a living wage and to have it be recognized and to get points in the standards. An obvious example is prior to the update, companies would have to pay a base wage that meets a living wage and exclude extra wage components like benefits or bonuses. The changes in 2022, we said, right now, those extra wage components can be added. And so there was more flexibility added into our approach. And the thinking was, with this extra flexibility, could we now actually ask all B Corps to pay a living wage? So that was the starting point in this exploration process.
Bernard, what would you say in a nutshell is the core purpose of the fair work topic? And why does it matter so much in today's world?
You can't build a sustainable, purpose-driven business on the backs of undervalued workers. So fair work is foundational because it recognizes that a company's greatest asset is its people. What I like about this topic is if you're working, likely you have an affinity with the fair work topic because you understand what unfair work is, and we all want, if we're working, fair work. So what I really like about this topic is that, again, if you're working, you have a connection to this. And actually, a lot of what's being asked is intuitive. There's a personal connection to the things that we're asking. So I also find actually in webinars that I do, training, this is probably the easiest topic of mine to explain and to have people understand why it's important.
It is one of the most impactful in terms of the people that are affected and some of the most important stakeholders, I think, to a business, for sure. What would you say to someone who is leading a 20-person B Corp? There's 20 workers at this B Corp, and these folks feel overwhelmed by these new fair work standards. Why should they care, and where should they start?
I'm curious, have you heard from companies that this size companies that they are feeling overwhelmed?
Interesting response.
We're asking the questions around here, Bernard. I mean, I think there's 20-person companies who feel overwhelmed by all the standards, not necessarily the fair work. So maybe that's a more fair, like, sort of.
I think the large companies would feel more overwhelmed by this question.
So I agree. If I look at fair work, it's pretty demanding of larger companies. There's, I think, one or two cases where it's demanding of smaller companies. But looking across topics, I wouldn't pick out fair work as more overwhelming than other topics for smaller companies.
So if we jump into some of the sub-requirements, if we start with the very first one, Fair Work 1.1, it emphasizes signed employment contracts in a language the worker understands. I'm curious, and a lot of our sources ask, why is it important to have something like this? And isn't it a sort of really basic thing to be included as part of B Corp certification?
Yeah, I can understand that as a reaction. It's a good example of a requirement related to a risk that's unlikely to materialize, but if it happens, it's a pretty bad thing. And there are enough cases to warrant it. I'm thinking here particularly of migrant workers where they've moved to another country, maybe don't speak the language, doing working really hard. And because they don't speak the language, they don't understand what language their contract is in. And that's a dangerous position to be in, because how do you advocate for your rights if you don't understand your contract? So that's the main reason we did put it in there, but also acknowledging that, well, in the US, it's not actually common to have employment contracts. At times there are offer letters, but even that is not required by law. And even places like the UK, where employment contracts are common, if you actually look at the law, what it says is a contract is required, but that could, in theory, be a verbal contract. And so a written employment contract isn't needed. So what we're saying, we want to be crystal clear, a written employment contract is in the best interest of the worker. And that's the expectation that we're going to set. And the last thing I'll mention is there's actually a plus for the audit process. So I've been an auditor myself for about 5 years. One of the first things I'll do is look at employment contracts to just understand what are people's basic terms and conditions. And so it's also from that perspective, it really helps the audit process if the auditor has access to employment contracts to understand what potential issues are, maybe even catch potential non-compliances stated in the contracts. That's a little plus, a little extra reason to require it.
And I will say that even though it is basic, I think it's actually not as common. It's like not only related to migrant workers, because for Lyft Economy, there was a while where we had no formal employment contracts for the partners of our company. We did have for the employees. And so I do think that it's important to still have it. I do know a lot of companies don't have role descriptions necessarily for people. Is this also part of the assessment? Are role descriptions required now?
Yes. So within the sub-requirement, the compliance criteria states exactly what we're expecting to see as part of employment contracts. And so role descriptions is part of that, as well as information around compensation, for example. We have integrated a little bit of flexibility because we got some really useful feedback from stakeholders in China and Myanmar, for example, saying that they have to work with government mandated contract templates. So actually, they may not be able to amend the employment contracts. And that's why the sub-requirement is phrased as it is, a little bit open. They have to provide employment contracts or offer letters. And then the compliance criteria specifies that if they can't amend the contract itself, they can issue a letter. So there's a lot of flexibility baked in, because globally, and this will be a recurring theme across a lot of these topic podcast episodes, I imagine, globally, you have to have that kind of flexibility.
Yeah, the last thing I'll say on this, I do think for listeners, there's probably a lot of companies listening, especially the small to medium, who maybe have employment contracts, but maybe not role descriptions. In smaller startup companies, it's not super common for everyone to have a fully fleshed out role description. So that's going to be some work for folks. And then if we move to FW2 in fair wage practices, why is it critical for companies to eliminate wage history questions from job applicants? And what specific systemic disparities is this aiming to prevent?
So this was one of the easier sub-requirements to put in, just because it's so glaringly necessary and impactful. What I notice in webinars when I talk about this requirement is, so actually let me take a step back and explain what it is. So under FW 2.1, companies are required to have a policy where they don't request wage histories from applicants. So that means in a recruitment process, companies shouldn't be asking applicants, what wage are you currently on? Or what is your preferred wage for this job? And the reason for that is that if someone was underpaid in the past, this increases the chance that they continue to be underpaid. So it perpetuates wage inequality. When I explain this on webinars, what I usually see is women nodding along to be like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. So I think for a lot of listeners, this will this will make sense and we'll feel like, okay, yeah, I've been in a situation where I'm asked about what my preferred wage is, and I felt uncomfortable because I knew I was underpaid in the past and I didn't want to continue being underpaid. So that's why this is needed, to break that cycle. And I start off by saying it's one of the easier ones to implement, and that's because there's quite a lot of consensus around this. It's been part of the women's empowerment principles for a very long time. And it's part of the new EU Pay Transparency Directive that was passed in 2023. So it's going to become EU law very soon. So it was a very easy one to put in to say, okay, let's align with best practice out there and stop this practice from happening.
And I imagine it's still pretty common. People are like, oh, what did you make at your last job before you get hired? So
yeah, a lot of times it's not asked with a bad intention. A lot of times it's either curiosity or wanting to manage their expectations, right? You don't want to waste someone's time if they're expecting a double salary of what you're able to pay. It's just that in most cases, it leads to bad outcomes for people who have been underpaid, and therefore it's just seen as a bad practice all around.
That's an interesting point too, in that, like, if we're not asking for workers' wage histories, that B Corps are also not required to, at least by this version of the standards, report the pay, what do you call it? Like the compensation in the job posting. Did you spend any time on that at all?
Yeah, so I was reflecting on what are some of the things I was hoping to put in the standards that didn't make it. And this is a good example of that. So I think it's New York State. You two will probably know this better than me. New York State, I think, passed regulation requiring companies to disclose the wage scale in job advertisements. And you can see this best practice popping up in more jurisdictions. And it makes a lot of sense, right? It both manages expectations and avoids a situation where someone is underpaid. And what we do say in this sub-requirement as well is a company can ask for preferred wage, but only if they first disclose the wage scale. But unfortunately, whilst looking into can we actually require all B Corps to disclose the wage scale when recruiting, even though we got a lot of positive feedback, we got some reluctance, particularly from B Corps in Asian countries, saying, we understand what you're trying to achieve with this, but this just feels a little bit too much in terms of transparency. Just it's a little bit too uncomfortable. So we recognize that there are sensitivities around how transparent companies can be around wages. We kind of took our foot off the gas, off the throttle, and said, okay, we won't require it just yet.
Not yet.
Not yet. Who knows? Things might change in the future.
I'm just thinking of, like, someone could say, yeah, our wage scale for this job is 50K to 250K. And then it's like, so it doesn't quite get at it. But I do think that maybe, yeah, how would you address a company saying that? Like, yeah, we have wage scales. It's 0 to 500K, somewhere in there.
Well, the good thing about wage scales is that you need it for all the different levels, right? And so at least within an organization, so what we require in the standards is that wage scales are set, this is FW 2.3, that wage scales are set internally and shared internally with workers. So you would never really have a case like that because you would have multiple levels and it would say a junior officer is this to this, and then the next one starts from that. You may have a little bit of overlap between ranges, but of course it's essentially tiered, it's in levels. So if a company decided to put 0 to 250 for each level, then workers would be like, this makes no sense. This doesn't help us.
I'll follow up on that, and then Amy can jump into the next question. So these are for larger companies. So for listeners who are getting a little bit concerned about wage scales, suddenly this is for large companies and above, which, Bernard, what is the cutoff? I'm going to test you right now. What's the revenue and employee numbers for large?
Oh, goodness. This is a great example of something that I see at least once a week. For some reason, I still have to look it up myself.
I think we have to print out like the table and
literally
like, put it in the physical
on my
copy.
desk. Yes, truly.
I'll get it tattooed on my own.
Yeah, tattooed.
I think it's 1,000 employees.
Just for large? I think it's
For
because
large,
medium. Oh, 250.
yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
250. So that's
75 million.
Yeah, exactly.
75 million
So
or 250.
from 250 workers based on full-time equivalent, or 75 million US dollars in annual revenue. And the reason why there's quite a few fair work requirements that only kick in at large is because they only really make sense if there is a large workforce. So if you think of wage scales, if you're 5-person organization, there's no point in having wage scales. That's too much structure. And so that only really makes sense from large. And the same with, for example, pay gaps. So this is something that I think listeners will find interesting, because I do often get the question why we don't, for example, require a racial or ethnic pay gap. And that's because pay gaps, it's mathematics. And so it only makes sense if you have a large enough sample size. From our research, there's different information out there. Some say you need at least 50 in each group. So if we talk about a gender pay gap, you need around 50 men, 50 women. I've seen other sources that say it's 100. If you look at a lot of national regulation on gender pay gap reporting, that kicks in at workforces that are around 200, 250, assuming then divided by half, assuming that in most places there's roughly 50% women, 50% men. And if you then look at, for example, racial or ethnic minorities, likely the workforce won't have enough of that minority for the calculation to have any statistical significance. So if you have a workforce of 500 people and 50 identify as a minority, that 50 won't be enough to make the calculation worthwhile. So that's why we don't require racial or ethnic pay gap reporting.
That's pretty fascinating. I don't know that I knew that, like some fun behind the scenes statistics, like math, statistics nerd stuff. But I also think that that's such an interesting set of numbers, because in a 200-person company, yeah, it's pretty difficult to have 50 people be a racial minority. It's quite uncommon, at least in the US and Canada. And for folks who are listening, I think there's so many opportunities in these standards to continue pursuing them, whether you're required to pursue them or not. And I do think that this is one of those things that makes a lot of sense to at least attempt, and to attempt it intentionally, but to be measuring workplace culture and pay gap data across gender, race, and other sort of underrepresented groups.
Yeah. I mean, what I'll highlight is, even though there's no requirement for example, racial and ethnic pay gap, the calculation and disclosure, the way that the impact topic is supposed to work is that there's other elements that help prevent and address any kind of discrimination, including wage discrimination. So we already spoke about not requesting wage histories. That is a prevention mechanism. There's another requirement to inform workers around how the wages are set. That level of transparency and awareness empowers workers to ask questions, also helps prevent wage gaps. And as you mentioned, Emmy, the requirements around workplace culture are also important, because what it means is there are problems around wages. And actually, it's not just the workplace culture requirement, FW4, but also FW3, which is about worker feedback. That's all about, regardless of what the issue is, whether that's wage discrimination or other issues, making sure that workers are empowered, that there is that healthy workplace dialogue, that workers can share, hey, these are my concerns, do something about it. The employer would then, in good faith, listen, consider, and take action. So that's also kind of this extra layer where, again, any issue can be addressed, including wage issues. Oh, and I forgot actually arguably the most important one, wages for the lowest paid, right? So if we're talking about wage gaps, one of the best ways to at least address gaps amongst the lower end of the scales is by making sure everyone meets a basic minimum. And that's what living wage does. That's what collective bargaining does really well.
Makes sense. If we shift to Fair Work 2.7, which addresses equal pay for work of equal value, Could you explain the distinction between this and sort of equal pay for equal work, and how the required gender-neutral analytical point method helps uncover and address some deeper pay inequities that might otherwise sort of remain hidden?
Yeah, this is always a mouthful, isn't it? Equal pay for work, equal value. It's a kind of term you kind of have to stop and think about as you say it. So that is different to equal pay for equal work, and I'll explain the difference. The second one, equal pay for equal work, is comparing two roles, in fact, two people, and just understanding, are they being paid the same or are they being paid similarly? So that would be, for example, if you have a company with cleaners, looking at two cleaners, maybe one male, one female, and saying, are they paid the same? And there's value in that, but equal pay for work of equal value goes further and does a better job of recognizing that sometimes people are in different roles, but they have the same value in what they're doing. And there's this great example from Spain. There was a court case many years ago where a hotel company was paying their cleaners and their bar staff different wages. The bar staff, mostly male, surprise, surprise, they were paid more than cleaning staff, mostly female. And what the court case said was, well, if you actually look at the value that these individuals bring through their roles, it's very comparable. And value can be determined through many different ways, but it's things like, what do you need to do the job? What level of responsibility is there? What happens if the job is not done well? What's the impact on the business? And they determined, you know what? The value is the same. Therefore, in this case, cleaners should be paid as much as the bar staff. And that's the real value of equal pay for work of equal value. It looks at roles. And so it actually protects and supports all kinds of people. So if you talk about racial and ethnic gaps, it could help them if that's where the inequality is, or if the inequality is between people with disabilities and other groups, then that's what it'll pick up. The analysis helps you just pick up on wherever that inequality is. So it works across all kinds of social identities.
That's really interesting. And the math behind value, I find that really fascinating. I should also clarify that this sub-requirement FW 2.7, equal pay for work of equal value, is for large companies, extra large companies, extra, extra large. So for folks who aren't seeing that in their impact platform, that's why. We were speaking about living wage earlier in the episode, but it's not mandatory for B Corp certification, despite B Lab's vision to lift workers out of poverty. What were the reasons for this flexibility, and how do these three different pathways in FW 2.8 balance the flexibility with the goal of fair compensation for the lowest paid employees?
So maybe to take a step back and explain to the listeners, we call it informally the living wage requirement, but the sub-requirement actually refers to wages for the lowest paid, because we're actually looking at this more broadly, because we don't want this just to be about living wage. We also want this to be about collective bargaining. So that's actually the first reason why we wouldn't ever actually mandate the payment of a living wage, is because collective bargaining is tremendously valuable. One of the reasons why it's very valuable, and in some cases more valuable than living wage is voluntary. Collective bargaining is rooted in a legal system. And so there's that legal accountability that living wage work doesn't have. Because in theory, what could happen, a company could say, I'm paying a living wage now, I'm going to stop tomorrow. Collective bargaining, that's not possible, because that happens through unions, and there has to be engagement. There have to be laws that are followed. Most countries around the world have some laws around freedom of association and how unions operate and negotiate. So there's a lot of value in collective bargaining. We actually saw in the pandemic, there's quite a few interesting case studies where companies said, look, we're really struggling with the impacts of the pandemic. We need to make some changes. And unions basically checked with workers, and they would say, right, rather than firing people, let's all go part-time. We will temporarily work less, be paid less, but we'd all rather continue having a job. That kind of negotiation is possible with collective bargaining. In a system with living wage, you don't necessarily have that.
Yeah, I will also say that I find collective bargaining to be better able to address the nuances across different regions and industries. And I think that unions and collective bargainings are able to really reflect what workers want in specific instances. And I really appreciate that.
Yeah. And I think it's unfortunate that unions, for some people in some jurisdictions, have kind of the knee-jerk reaction of like, oh no, we don't like it, or it's risky. I think there's a lot of reasons why unions make sense. And there's so many good examples, if we look globally, of unions being highly effective. So I think there's enough positive examples out there for us to say, fine, there's maybe a few, particularly historically, a few bad examples or working with unions not going well. But by and large, both conceptually and practically, it makes a lot of sense to recognize collective bargaining as an equal to living wage.
Maybe, do you want to go into the three breakouts, the sub components of the living wage? 2.8 A, B, C is probably worth mentioning. Do you have that tattooed?
Yeah, that's tattooed into my brain practically. So we spoke before about this being the most time-consuming sub-requirement. I think we knew from the beginning that we were going to always look at options. So maybe to clarify also with the listeners, living wage is not mandated, is not required. And that wasn't a last minute change. We know that already 2 years ago in the drafts, it's already there that a living wage wouldn't be required. We were already looking at options and flexibility going back over 2 years ago. So there's been various variations of these options, but where we landed was 3 options. They all fall under the header of wages for the lowest paid, as I mentioned. The first is to actually pay a living wage, and that would be a family living wage to all workers. I should add, actually, it's to all employees. So an important clarification for this impact topic is in our standards, same as V6, version 6, is the distinction between workers and employees, where workers is a broader category. So all of this only relates to employees. And we can go into more detail on why that is in a moment. So the first option is paying a living wage. The second is paying a collectively bargained wage. And then the third option is essentially this: if you don't fall in A or B, here is this flexible approach where you can still do something useful and impactful, meaningful on wages for the lowest paid employees. And there are several options that companies can choose from. So what they actually need to do first is do a living wage assessment, essentially, understand living wage gaps. And then from a list of options, they have to choose and meet 2 of those. Some examples from that list: making sure that wages increase with inflation, paying or providing free childcare. Another example is paying 7% pension contribution. So this is what it means is providing, in addition to the wages, as a benefit to workers, 7% of their wage towards their pension. And so all of them are carefully crafted to still be about wages for the lowest pay, to still be about doing something meaningful that impacts people when it comes to wages. But it's in this other category, recognizing that companies can't pay a living wage or can't pay a collectively bargained wage. And in a moment, we can talk a little bit more about some of those limitations.
Yeah, like how would you respond to critics who might say, oh, this 2.8C gives companies an out. Like they don't really actually have to do it. So it makes the living wage concept more, it doesn't lack the teeth. How did you balance that potential critique versus, I was in those conversations with you where a lot of companies were saying like, I literally cannot be a B Corp if I have to start paying a family living wage now. And it's a lot of, for listeners, it's a lot of like manufacturing, retail, a lot of companies in the US that have food, manufacturing, retail, where the model of the company is just not set up, unfortunately, even though they're B Corps, to pay a family living wage right off the bat. So you have the critique, but then you have the reality that there's actually a fair chunk of companies that can't pay it.
I think I also just want to dig into that a little bit more. It's like there are business models out there, and especially in the B Corp community, that still are built around people, but still what we heard a lot of was like the economic forces and like the political landscape and labor laws, especially I think in the US, we heard a lot from that folks find particularly limiting and just extremely unsupportive. There's just like a real regulatory landscape that's lacking a sort of like living wage across the board in so many ways that I found disappointing to hear, but also like it makes sense to a certain extent.
Yeah, this really highlights the value of our public consultations. There was just a lot of feedback to say, we understand the intent of paying a living wage, but the barriers are real. And as you mentioned, Ryan, sometimes it's the company's barriers and their sector. And I think as you're alluding to, I mean, sometimes it's about the entire economy and how economies are set up. And so what we understood from this feedback is there are legitimate barriers that companies face to paying a living wage. Some concrete examples I can give are, there was one company that worked in a sector where the government sets the rates that they can charge. I think it had something to do with insurance. And so the rates that they charge their clients, of course, are then set, which means that limits or kind of puts a ceiling on what they can pay their workers. And another example was a company, I think they sold ice cream, and they just had a lot of really young workers, 18 years old. Most of them didn't have a family, and then they have to pay a family living wage, which is significantly higher than an individual living wage. So those are real barriers. And if we look, zoom out and look at economic systems, there are some economies that are just really don't support payment of wages. And there's a very big contrast between, for example, Northern European countries and the US. The US is a massive outlier when it comes to a lot of these points, which is why, as on the back of the consultation, we organized those deep dive focus groups with US companies that you two were part of to really get really in-depth feedback on how does the US economic system and the regulation there hamper progress on wages. And a few examples that came up are, well, it's an odd example of a highly developed country with really low wages, and both low wages in terms of real wages, what's being paid, as well as what the government sets as minimum wages. So people out there will be interested, particularly outside of the US, to know, for example, the US is an outlier in terms of tipping. If you've ever traveled to US, I absolutely hate it, that this like tipping culture, but it's really ingrained. And even legally, there's a lower minimum wage for tipped jobs, as little as $2 something, I think, per hour. And so that complicates things. And another example is US healthcare. Again, the US is an outlier because healthcare and access to healthcare is tied to employment. And so you have the employer often providing access to healthcare as a benefit to workers, which for those outside the US, particularly for those in Europe, is bonkers, right? That it's tied to healthcare. And it's no one's fault. It's not the US company's fault that this is the reality they're in. It just is what it is. And we have to recognize it and meet companies where they are, and recognize that these barriers are there. And I think this segues well into the third set of barriers that we saw. And it's more related to the methodologies of the living wage estimates. So we recognize 19 estimates globally. I'm pretty proud of this because it means we have global coverage. Some countries have only one provider. Some countries like the US have multiple. So in the US, there's MIT Calculator and Living Wage for Us. Now, if we look at these 19 methodologies, these are all independent institutions that have their own methodologies. We do require a base minimum to be met, but there's still inconsistencies amongst these methodologies. And so what you actually have is a situation where if we were to say all B Corps have to pay a living wage. Because the methodology is different in each country, the standard is actually different. And so there's actually a matter of fairness and equity here, because it wouldn't be the same requirement across different countries. It's harder to meet the standard in the US than it is in other countries because of the methodology in that particular country. To make the point really, really clear, so I mentioned US healthcare and the complications there. It's been really hard for us to find a way to allow companies to account for their contribution to access to healthcare, because there's a matter of comparability and there's a matter of individual versus family plans, which people outside the US, it'll mean nothing to you, but just know it's extremely complex. We spent a lot of time trying to understand this and trying to find a fair way that companies can have that contribution be recognized in meeting a living wage. And it's been really hard, and we haven't been able to do it in a way where all companies in the US can have all of their contribution recognized. And so that is a gap, and it's a very clear example of how the methodologies and the realities of, in this case, the US, the macroeconomic realities, create very real barriers to requiring all companies to pay a living wage.
Oh, I can make so many comments about it's why we're great, baby. Why the US is so great. But I'll skip the diving into the political commentary. I think where I wanted to go next is to combine a few questions that are related to sort of worker feedback, workplace culture, and then measuring and improving the culture. So I'm curious if you could maybe, as best as you can, talk about maybe weaving these together. Like, how did you think about this worker feedback element, involving them in decisions, plus measuring the culture and actually improving the culture? Like, how do those things fit together, and how do you think through that?
Particularly in the early days, when actually this applies not just to this topic, but all topics, you're pulled in many different directions, right? So we have thousands of stakeholders, and there's a lot of consensus, but there's also areas, some kind of niche areas where say, hey, this is really important. I think all B Corp should do this. So in terms of themes and topics, we're pulled in many different directions. And particularly when it comes to workers, there's so many directions to go. Also, if you look at, for example, other labor standards, if you look at the work from the International Labor Organization and their definition of decent work, it includes actually things that are not in this impact topic. One of the things that we were conscious of is, rather than trying to go in all directions and try to cover everything, if we have requirements around healthy workplace dialogue and good faith exchange, feedback and engagement, what it means is, regardless of what the issue is, whatever the priority is for workers, they can advocate and they can make that happen within their workplace. So we spoke earlier about wages, but it could really be anything. It could also be, for example, the office location. Maybe they don't want to be where they are, and that is the most important thing to them. By having requirements that focus on feedback, engagement, and dialogue, we're hoping that will be these kind of workplaces where workers can say, we care about our office location. The employer will take that seriously, and that kind of change will happen without us having to have some obscure sub-requirement about the office location.
Yeah, it's really speaking to those processes versus outcomes, just the real emphasis on processes for some of these elements. I really appreciate personally, like even the mention of psychological safety, let alone the facilitation of it and encouraging it, because it's so fundamentally important for folks to be able to feel like they can provide that, or they can speak what's on their mind, that they know that they'll be heard and they'll be seen, is such a huge element of that. I think in where the Fair Work standards ended up, where did it go beyond what you were originally thinking for the standards? Did they end up being more conservative in certain areas and more ambitious in other areas than you were anticipating?
So one example of going further is there is a requirement, a sub-requirement to actually close the gender pay gap. So this is something that we're quite proud of, because if you look at other standards out there, well, either they're a reporting standard and they just require the disclosure, or they're a standard that's about performance, but don't necessarily require the closure of gender pay gap. And that's something that we put in. And honestly, I was expecting a lot of pushback, a lot of companies saying this is just not possible, but there's actually a lot of support in the consultation. I should clarify what it actually requires is the closure of the gap by 50% to have the gap essentially each certification cycle. But that's probably the best example I can think of where I managed to put something in that exceeded my expectations. And then an example of something that didn't make it. Well, actually, before we spoke about transparency of wage scales and job advertisements, I really wanted to put that in, but that, of course, we didn't manage to. And I think another example is around working hours, which I think is also a good example of the limitations we face because of the compliance and certification space that we're in. I'll explain. Working hours are a global problem, and they're a problem across industries, right? You two work in consultancy, so you know that working hours can be an issue. We know it's also an issue in agriculture and manufacturing. And generally the issue is working too many hours, whether that's regular hours or overtime, and whether that's voluntary or involuntary. There's a lot of problems around working hours. And so we really did want to address this. The problem is any requirement around working hours assumes that working hours are measured. So let's say, for example, that you say no one's allowed to work more than 10 hours overtime a week. That implies that the company has to be tracking and monitoring overtime hours per person. But in most companies, overtime hours aren't tracked. They aren't measured. Plus, it's quite easy to game the system. It's quite easy to change the numbers. And so this is a perfect example of something that we cared about. We really wanted to be in the standard, but this is a limitation because what you put in the standard has to be verifiable, and this is just not verifiable. So it didn't end up in the standard, unfortunately.
Makes sense. If you could wave a magic wand and make one fair work requirement mandatory for all B Corps tomorrow, which one would you choose and why?
So I'm gonna take liberties with this magic wand and say it doesn't only make things mandatory, but it makes sure that companies, B Corps, are actually doing it well. I would then focus on FW3 and 4, which is all about the exchange of information, getting feedback, seeking, considering, and addressing worker feedback, and making sure that there's measurement of workplace culture. Because if that's done well, it's truly transformative and really powerful. And it helps both the worker, because it means that they can advocate for their rights. They have a partner in the employer that's willing to work with them to improve things. So there's clear, tangible benefits for workers. But on the flip side, there's also tangible benefits for the employer, because if we think of B Corp, we think of purpose-driven companies. Purpose-driven companies work when everyone's engaged and locked into the purpose. And so that requires a workplace where people feel heard, they feel valued, they're engaged. So I really see this, even though maybe in some ways it feels like it's kind of buried away, at the end of the Fair Work impact topic, it actually has a lot of links to the purpose and stakeholder governance impact topic, and arguably the entire standards and our entire theory of change. It really is so fundamental to the work that we're doing and the change that we want to see in the world.
Can I ask Bernard, why not have, it's very impractical, but bear with me. Why not require B Corps to have some sort of worker ownership or a steward ownership? Or why isn't it mandated that workers have a voice on the board of directors or something like that in the new B Corp standards? Did those ever come up?
Sure. So these are examples of very good practices that are usually very good and make a lot of sense, but don't make sense for all contexts. And it's the kind of thing that if we were to make a requirement, it could have unintended, unfair consequences on companies. And of course, that we would want to avoid that. And the power of impact business models is that's what they try to capture, right? They try to capture these really, really good practices where companies can go above and beyond, can demonstrate this is something that I've done concretely within my company to generate positive outcomes. But we did explore, perhaps interesting for the listeners to know, we did explore in the consultation in the entire development process, can we make IBMs mandatory? Can we actually have each B Corp have at least one IBM? But based on feedback and the general thought that, you know what, you can have an amazing company that's doing everything right, has a lot of positive impact without an IBM, the combination of the consultation feedback as well as that kind of counterintuitive thought means it doesn't make sense to mandate an IBM for every company. And it's the same for these two examples, Ryan. It really is, they are examples of best practice, and we would want to see more of it, but we can't require it necessarily of all companies. We are going to see whether, what will the new IBMs look like and to what extent are these two captured in them. That's definitely something that we're going to look at.
Was there at some point one of the wages paid to lowest paid workers, one of the ways to fulfill the wage requirements was worker ownership, or am I misremembering that?
Yep. Yeah, good memory, Emmy. So for anyone that was involved in the consultation and saw the second draft, so that's the most recent draft before they were finalized, we had IBMs integrated because the working logic was we're going to launch the standards with the existing IBMs. As IBMs were taken out in the final standards, that's why, for example, worker ownership isn't there. We did look at, can we convert the IBM into something else? But unfortunately, we didn't have enough time to make that happen. You can imagine for something as complex and important as worker ownership, it's not something that one day to the next you just convert into some quick criteria. So we said, you know what, given how important it is, let's put it to one side. There's an entire separate work stream now on IBMs to look at what is the best way to implement them. So that's essentially what we decided is the best way forward to make sure that they're treated with the respect they deserve.
Awesome. Yeah, maybe we could look ahead. So what are the next ambitions or areas of focus for B Lab in evolving the Fair Work standards, especially considering this long-term goal of potentially asking all B Corps to pay a living wage or collectively bargained wage in the future? And maybe you could weave IBMs into that. Do you see, maybe if you see those coming in the next year or so, or that's more no, that'll be 3 years away and when we redo everything?
On IBMs, I can imagine a lot of people want to know when they're going to come. It's too early to say anything on that. What I can say on living wage is, we spoke earlier about inconsistent methodologies globally. We're keeping a close eye on the work of Wage Map. That's a global initiative that they're trying to harmonize standards. So the members are the different organizations for different countries, basically saying, hey, this is what I do in my methodology. What do you do? Let's harmonize. That'll unlock opportunities for us in our standards. So we're keeping a close eye on that. And beyond that, to be honest, if we actually just look at what we're doing, and this is something that I often say on kind of webinars and podcasts, is the new standards are a massive, giant experiment. There's so much new content. There's so much of what we're doing that is new. So I think to a large extent, the future is very hard to predict. We're going to be, as always, we're going to be reacting to the incoming feedback that we get from our stakeholders from the B Corp community. But it's really hard to say what that feedback will be, just because, again, there's so much new content going out there. It is one big, massive experiment. So beyond living wage, let's see where the community takes us and where we spend our time trying to fix things and trying to improve things.
And then last question here is, what do you need right now and how can listeners help support your work?
I would say keep engaging in healthy criticism. So if I look back on the past 4 years, I've been with B Lab for 4 years now, the public consultations really is a highlight of my 4 years at B Lab, but actually even the highlight of my career, just because it perfectly exemplifies what healthy engagement and criticism looks like from both sides. We had B Corps and expert stakeholders dedicating their time, providing criticism in a constructive manner. And then from our side, we were trying to make sure they had enough information. We provided compensation for participants from underrepresented groups. So there's a really amazing coming together of two sides wanting to make the standards better and improve the impact of the community overall. Let's keep doing that going forward. I think this podcast is a great example of that. I've been listening to just about every episode. Really, really good content, really good discussion on these podcasts. Let's keep doing that. There's also local B Corp events, engage in those and other kinds of formats. Please know that, when you're speaking to B Corps now, and actually all members of the B Corp community, when you provide feedback, we do take it very, very seriously. So the standards team literally on a weekly basis is reacting to feedback that we get from all sorts of stakeholders, thinking, how can we address this? And we are very conscientious to try to take that feedback seriously and to try to go back to those stakeholders to explain what we've done with that feedback.
Well, thanks so much, Bernard, for coming on. And yeah, it's been great to get a little bit of your insight, a little bit of behind the scenes. And I imagine hopefully you're able to sleep a little bit better at night than you have the last 3 years. Maybe you've been sleeping fine the whole time, but I really appreciate you coming on, and we'll have to have you back on for the other couple sections that you manage.
Yeah, honestly, sleep is not something that I worry about a lot. I'm blessed with good sleeps, the ability to have good sleeps. Interestingly, I think is this feeling of in the early development stages, things were difficult, but actually it might be the other way around, where now the rubber's hitting the road, so to speak, where we're looking at the transition, how do others actually do this? There's a lot of aspects of that make the work more difficult because there are more restrictions and parameters that we need to work around. 2 years ago, it was still a bit of a blank canvas where we could think, okay, this is the direction we want to go. So maybe difficult for a different reason is how I would describe 2 years ago versus now.
Well, we appreciate you, and thanks again for coming on.
Yes, and thanks so much for your work on these topics.
Thank you, and I'll see you soon for Jedi and human rights.
Hey, Beyond the Bee listeners. If you're looking for even more inspiring conversations with leaders on the front lines of our movement towards just futures, be sure to subscribe to Next Economy Now, produced by the team at Lyft Economy. Next Economy Now broadens the focus beyond the B Corp movement to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, democratic, equitable, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy. Check out our latest episodes at lifteconomy.com/podcast. You can subscribe to Next Economy Now on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts.